Hi everyone, it's James here. Welcome to another video. So this is going to be another instalment in my series Incomplete Collections. This is where I celebrate the gaps in my collection with reference to a particular artist. And today we are going to be looking at Santana. And I'm going to call the video The Slippery Slope of Santana because this is exactly how I have experienced collecting this particular artist. My history with Santana was so patchy for so many years. This album I've had in my collection for donkey's years. I don't even remember where I picked it up. And until I got onto The Slippery Slope, I don't even think I'd listened to it, maybe once. He really wasn't an artist that really figured on my radar at all. And then what happened about 5 or 6 years ago, around about the time I joined the VC, or I discovered the VC, I picked up this record on CD. This is his debut album, and I enjoyed it, but I wasn't that enamoured with it. I wasn't all that impressed with it. I remember I took it on holiday somewhere, Mallorca or somewhere, and I had it on my iPod. And I remember walking up and down the beach listening to it and thinking, this is okay, this is kind of what I imagined Santana would be. It's just, you know, Latin flavoured rock music, Latin jam rock. And I thought to myself, this is pretty good for, you know, for what it is. And you know, I'd seen clips of Woodstock at Santana, so I knew what it involved. But I think I just thought to myself, okay, well if that's what Santana is, I don't think I need any more Santana in my collection. I've got a best of, I've got the debut album which seems to pretty much represent him and the band. Do I really need to start delving any deeper? And what I'd started to notice in record shops is that Santana records, where they seem to be 2 to a penny, not massively common but fairly common records, they used to turn up. They still do turn up, not quite as much as they used to, interestingly, but maybe about 5 or 6 years ago in charity shops, Oxfam, you know, places like that, I would see them. They would crop up, and they would always be cheap as well. They would always be maybe somewhere in the region of, you know, under a fiver. And there's that strange kind of inverse snobbery thing that goes on. You know, you're constantly bemoaning the fact that these records that you really want are too expensive and you can't afford them. And then, but you sort of overlook records which you start to perceive as being maybe a bit run-of-the-mill. And I think I started to view Santana as being a bit run-of-the-mill, one of those artists who has a vast back catalogue, and I got it into my head that the records would probably all be quite samey, and I didn't really want to have groaning shells of Santana in my collection, essentially. So that's kind of what happened for a long, long time. So I knew that he was a slippery slope artist that I didn't particularly want to get onto. And then a couple of things happened. Chris on the vinyl community, who's sadly his channel is no longer there, he's taken it down. This is Chris Vinyl Orchard, did a very, very interesting video showing his Santana collection, and he talked about him very eloquently, talked about the band very eloquently, and you know, discussed the fact that there were all these phases in the group's career and they'd gone through all these different eras and, you know, with different lineups, and that always gets my interest. As soon as I start hearing that a band has had loads of lineup changes and have gone through loads of artistic phases, I immediately start thinking, okay, this sounds like something I should be interested in. Anyway, so Chris's video was really good, and then what happened is I picked up this book, which is Santana's autobiography. I think it is ghostwritten for him, but it does come through in his own voice, really. It's called The Universal Tone. And you know, really, really interesting book. Given that I'd known nothing about Santana whatsoever, it was really interesting to get into his life story. The fact that he'd come from nothing. He was a Mexican dishwasher living in San Francisco, and he just learnt the guitar and, you know, got into jazz and free jazz and spiritual jazz and spirituality itself. You know, he became really interested in you know, in meditation and alternative philosophies and everything. Really interesting individual. It's quite funny because a few years ago, or quite a long time ago now, I actually went to San Francisco and I lived in the Mission District for about 6 weeks. I had a friend who lived down there, and she told me about Santana, about Carlos Santana, and the fact that he'd started his career really in San Francisco. So I kind of, you know, I had a bit of background, a bit of personal background. I used to wander around the Mission District thinking, wow, you know, this is pretty cool. And this is years before I'd even thought of getting into Santana. Anyway, so to cut a long story short, that book, I thought to myself, right, Santana is definitely a band that I would like to check more out. And I think at that point I'd already started to get onto the slippery slope. I picked up a copy. Okay, let's just backtrack a little bit. So his first album, their first album should I say, Santana, came out in, well, they signed to Columbia in October of 1968, and the album came out in August of 1969. In the autobiography, Santana himself said that he wasn't very happy with the first album and he didn't really see it as a particularly great recording. And that's quite interesting given the fact that, you know, clearly having heard the first album, I didn't really respond to it as being something that, oh God, I really need to check this out. So that was quite interesting. It is a perfectly decent debut. It's got a couple of great tracks on it. Evil Ways, which is a track by Sonny Henry, and Jingo, which was by the Nigerian percussionist Babatunde Alatunji. So, you know, straight away in Santana Records, you get to start exploring this kind of vast seam of Latin music. He had all sorts of influences in his early life. You know, he was really into Tito Puente and lots of kind of interesting Latin music. So you do start to explore a lot through his music. You know, he's a kind of a bit of a gateway artist, really. So anyway, that was the debut album. Like I said, fantastic artwork on this. And on this record you've got the full lineup of Santana. You've got Carlos on guitar and vocals, Mike Carabello on conga and percussion, Dave Brown on bass, fantastic bass player, Jose Chapito Arreyes on timbales, conga and percussion, the fantastic Michael Shreve, the drummer Michael Shreve, who sort of got into the band just by accident really, on drums, Greg Rowley on piano, who became a very notable musician in rock history, as we'll see later on, piano, organ and vocals. And you know, that was the first album, and that was the lineup that stayed true through the first three records. Now of course they played Woodstock after that, which is one of the most legendary live concerts of all time, and I think it was that made Santana a household name in the US at least. And then they recorded Abraxas, the follow-up, in 1970, in June 1970. And this album is really, really, really strong. I think it's an excellent album. If I'd heard this one first, I probably would have immediately started buying Santana's records. This is more what you think of as being that really great kind of fusion between kind of hard rock in a way, blues rock, hard rock, and all the Latin influences. You've got a wide range of material on this record. You've got stuff which is written by the band. The track Singing Winds, Crying Beasts is by Mike Carabello. You've got the absolutely immortal combination of Black Magic Woman, which of course is the Peter Green Fleetwood Mac song, spliced with Gypsy Queen by Gabos Szabo, who I think is another Latin composer and musician. Oi Comba, which is one of the biggest Santana hits, which was a Tito Chapito song, and a really great track actually called Incident at Neshaba. It sounds like a funky TV theme from the 1970s, spliced with Horace Silver. Carlos Santana's jazz enthusiasms had started to seep into the music quite deeply. He was heavily into Miles Davis, heavily into John Coltrane, and that seam of music was only going to deepen over the subsequent records. And also on this album you've got the track Mother's Daughter, which is a Greg Rowley tune, I think. He sings it, and he does a great kind of Steve Marriott impression on that track. It's got, you know, touches of Small Faces on it. And I started to learn, you know, when I was reading the book, as with every big major band in history, Santana had certain problems, interpersonal problems in the band. You had Greg Rowley, and then a guitarist called Neil Schoen, who joined the group just prior to the recording of the third album, which is known as Santana 3. And my understanding is, from my limited reading, is that Greg Rowley and Neil Schoen, they sort of wanted to steer the band down a more kind of hard rock, classic rock direction, whereas Carlos Santana and Michael Shreve and the percussionists in the group, they kind of wanted to go explore more down the Latin jazz kind of route. So by the time of the third album, which is the final album to contain the original lineup, you've got this kind of schism starting to form, with the two different branches starting to go off. Of course, Neil Schoen and Greg Rowley would end up going off and forming Journey. So you can kind of see there was a definite difference in the band. Anyway, The full lineup is still present and correct on the third album, and this is my favourite of the Santana albums I've heard. I think it's really intense, kind of blazing virtuosity, just fantastic playing. It was released in October 1971. It's got the Tower of Power horns on it, on the great track Everybody's Everything. It's got another Tito Puente song, Para los Rumberos. It's got the track Jungle Strut, which was written by the jazz composer Gene Ammons, and then the brilliant Curtis Mayfield kind of tribute, Everybody's Coming Our Way, which I think was a big hit single, and it's just one of the most great kind of feel-good, summery pop songs you'll ever hear. It's absolutely brilliant. And the album really builds to this incredible crescendo, you know, towards the end, Para los Rumberos at the end, really pile-driving riffs, and it's just a great kind of, I'd say probably kind of heavy rock album. I mean, obviously not heavy rock like Deep Purple, Black Sabbath, but just lots and lots of very intense playing on it, from the percussionists, but also from Carlos himself in conjunction with Neil Schon. Just this great kind of guitar interplay. And Carlos Santana's guitar playing is just something else. He was able to kind of channel, you know, Jimi Hendrix, John Coltrane, all kinds of influences into this kind of searing, psychedelic guitar style, which is really roof-raising on occasion. So that was Santana 3, and we're still only in October 1971, so I guess they're a bit like Led Zeppelin in a way. They did a lot of great work kind of quite early on, really, and by the time we get to the next album, they've already started to evolve into something else. Now this next record, which was released in October of 1972, Caravan Surrey, or Caravan Surrey. I heard this when I went to stay with John Downing, 6-inch pianist 319, in his house a couple of years ago when we went for a VC meetup, and he played me this record, and I thought, wow, this is fantastic. This is when Carlos Santana started to get in seriously into the kind of spiritual jazz side of things, much more free form. CBS did not want him to do this album. Clive Davis at CBS really wanted him to carry on doing the kind of, you know, the stuff that he'd been doing on the first 3 albums, the kind of Latin pop rock stuff. They really didn't want him to go down this kind of jazz route. But Carlos stayed true to his artistic sensibilities, but there had been a bit of a split in the band. Really interesting history as we get into this kind of section. Carlos started to sack members of the band basically for being you know, dope heads. He sacked David Brown, the bass player, because he just couldn't get off whatever drugs he was on at the time. And then he also fired Michael Carabello as well. Can't quite remember what the issue was with him. And there was this bizarre split that happened around this time when the other musicians kind of stuck up for Dave Brown and Michael Carabello, and for a while Carlos himself had to leave the band in protest. It was a kind of it's me or them type situation. And the band Santana actually played a few concerts without Carlos Santana in the band before they were forced to accept that they couldn't really do without Carlos. So they had to get him on the phone and say, right, okay, yeah, we'll agree to your terms. We'll let David Brown and Michael Carabello go, and you come back. So that's the kind of convoluted background to the recording of this record, which was done with, you know, a load of other musicians. You had Mingo Lewis coming in on congas, and I mean, he's a name that crops up in rock history so many times. He's on so many different albums. You know, he played with the Tubes later on, and he had a solo career as well. The pianist Tom Costa joins the band for this record, and he's got a much more kind of free-flowing jazz style. You do have Greg Rowley on here still. I think this is his final album. But he was not very happy with the direction that the band was going to go in from this point onwards. The Cuban bongo player Armando Peraza is on this record. I think he's on the next one too. And like I said, it's a very, very spiritual record, really. It's very ambient. It starts off very ambient, and it goes through this kind of labyrinthine journey, really, with lots of great guitar playing, lots of textured, layered, building trance-like grooves, and, you know, a clear Miles Davis influence coming through, a Bitches Brew influence coming through, basically, on Caravan Surrey. It wasn't a big seller, but Carlos still stuck to his guns. You know, he kind of wanted to carry on doing this kind of music. And at this point, he was really getting into the spirituality, and he'd become acquainted with this guru, Sri Chinmoy, who was some kind of Eastern guru, you know, we're entering into the world of spirituality now, kind of George Harrison territory. But he was also the guru of a very famous, or at least a very successful at this point, jazz fusion musician by the name of John McLaughlin. And it was through the connection with Sri Chinmoy, really, that these two musicians got together, and it resulted in Love, Devotion, Surrender, which came out in March of 1973. And this album is a kind of fusion masterclass. I picked this up perhaps last year, and it's a pretty difficult record, I think. You have to really like that John McLaughlin sound. I do struggle with him occasionally. Very, very virtuosic stuff, you know, very intense, very sandpapery at times, very rough, hard sound, you know. It's not always that melodic. But Carlos, he held his own, you know. I think he was a bit intimidated going into it, but he and John managed to carve it up between them, and it's a record I'm still working on. It's one that's going to definitely stay in the collection, but like I said, it's not the easiest album on the ear, really. So then in November '73, the follow-up to Caravan Surrey was the album Welcome, and this was some VCLT from my good friend Sean Whelan, that's SW Studio Productions. He sent me this record, and this kind of is another Caravan Surrey, really, but it's more mellow. It's got less guitar playing on it and more keyboards. There were two keyboard players in the band by this point. The title track is by John Coltrane. You've got a very nice version. Well, you've got a song called Going Home, which is based on Dvorak's New World Symphony, and the singer Flora Purim from Return to Forever sings on Yours Is the Light. It's quite a mellow album. I think in later years Santana himself acknowledged that it was a record where he kind of took a back seat in terms of being a guitar player. But it's a very nice listen, and it's a record that, again, will be staying in the collection. Now I'm on the slippery slope, there's no looking back. So that was Welcome from '73, and then we've got another kind of sidestep. This is a record that's been in my collection for quite a long time. I picked this up maybe about 5 or 6 years ago. I saw somebody showing it on the VC, and I thought, I've got to have that. You know, just buy a record for its cover, why not? I mean, sometimes you just do that, don't you? But this is his collaboration with Alice Coltrane, which came out in September of 1974. Alice Coltrane, obviously, the wife of John Coltrane, harp player. Interesting record. Side 1 is very uplifting and quite nice, quite pleasant on the ear. Side 2 is definitely, it's hard work, it's very free, it's very abstract, but it's worth hearing, It's a great lineup on this record. You've got Tom Coster again, who is by now the Santana keyboard player. You've got Dave Holland, the great bass player, the great fusion bass player, who played with Miles Davis. I think he's on Bitches Brew, isn't he? And you've also got Jack DeJohnette on drums. It's definitely worth hearing it, and with a cover like that, why not, So that was Illumination, September '74, and then we're kind of approaching the end now, really. A couple of gaps in the collection now. Borboleta, October 1974, that was a new Santana record, don't have that one. Amigos from March '76, don't have that one. So there's two more records that I have in my collection, and this is the next one that I'll show, and this is Moonflower. And this is a half studio and a half live set. There've been some more lineup changes at this point. I'm not going to try and talk you through all the different lineup changes. At this point Santana had basically dissolved into this ever-changing, ever-mutating free-for-all, really. The band started out as being Santana, named after the guy in the band, but now it's just whoever wants to play, or whoever Carlos wants to get into the band, basically, is Santana. So Moonflower, which came out in October of 1977, with the most incredible gatefold on this one. And I've listened to this album a couple of times, and it's pretty intense. You've got to be in a Santana mood for this. It's lashings of Santana, to coin a phrase, jam type music, and lots of wailing guitar solos and intensity. But it's quite good fun having a record which is part live and part studio. That kind of works quite nicely. So yeah, that was Moonflower, October '77. And then October '78, this is the last record I've got to show. This is Inner Secrets, which is where Santana really 1978 he starts to go into a more kind of radio pop, radio friendly direction, and he doesn't lose his way exactly, but he does become, arguably for a while, I think, from what I've read, what I can gather, a rather less interesting artist for a few years. He did make a big comeback later on, of course. In the 90s, he had a couple of really big hit albums, and he became absolutely huge again. You know, he shifted platinum. He had this extraordinary comeback. But at this point, I think he was at a bit of a low ebb. And this record, it's okay. It's kind of enjoyable, but it's just, I don't know. It's got a slightly kind of jaded sound. It sounds like a group who are maybe starting to flag a little bit. The performances are not so sharp. There's a sort of flat sound to the production. Not a wonderful record, but you know, I just picked it up because I'm on the slippery slope. This is it. I mean, I don't know how many more records I'm going to pick up by Santana. I wouldn't mind getting hold of a copy of the two that are missing there, Borboleta and Amigos. I wouldn't mind getting them, but I mean, after 1978, Inner Secrets, there's still maybe 15 more albums, you know. So I think, hopefully anyway, I think I've kind of reached the bottom of the slope. Really, maybe 2 more records to get if I see them, but I'm not going to go kind of hunting them down. But anyway, hope you enjoyed that video. Like I said, it's just the story really of me just plunging into this band, into this artist that I never really had any interest in before. You know, I guess it just goes to show how easily you can end up going on a journey like that, particularly when the records are so easily obtained. You know, that's what makes Santana such a kind of deadly slippery slope, really. That's it. Hope you enjoyed the video. Leave us some comments below. Let me know what you think of Santana. Are there any records I really need to have, or do you think that I've basically got everything covered there? I'd love to hear about that. So take care, folks. See you soon. Bye bye.